Imagine being 12 years old. You've just finished your school's Christmas concert. You're tired, you're excited for Christmas, and you're thinking about the friends you're about to say goodbye to for winter break. Someone drives you home, you walk up the driveway, you go inside, and then you simply disappear. No scream, no obvious struggle, no broken window, no sign that anyone forced their way into the house. Just your shoes sitting on the floor, your favorite shawl left on the couch, and a space heater still warming an empty room. For 35 years, Jonelle Matthews' family had no idea what happened to her. Then in 2019, workers digging into the ground just miles from where Jonelle had once lived uncovered human remains. And what investigators discovered next completely changed the case. Because Jonelle hadn't run away. She hadn't gotten lost. She had been murdered. And after nearly 4 decades, police finally had a name. A man who had lived only a couple of miles from Jonelle's home. A man who had attended the same church. A man who had once been a youth pastor. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a man who had inserted himself into the investigation years before police ever considered him a suspect. This is a tragic story of Jonelle Matthews. Jonelle Matthews was born on February 9, 1972 in Santa Barbara, California. Her biological mother, Terry Vieira Martinez, was only 13 years old when she gave birth to her. Terry initially tried to care for her daughter, but after a month, she realized that she simply wasn't prepared to become a mother at such a young age. So in March of 1972, Jonelle was unfortunately placed for adoption. Around the same time, however, a couple named Jim and Gloria Matthews were looking to add another child to their family. They lived in Greeley, Colorado, and already had a daughter named Jennifer. When Jim and Gloria learned about Jonelle, they decided to adopt her. And just like that, Jonelle became part of the Matthews family. She grew up alongside Jennifer and by all accounts presented in this case was a bright, energetic, independent child. She had a personality that could be described as a little sassy at times, but she was also very intelligent, outgoing, and incredibly positive. Jonelle had a habit of making even the smallest things feel very important. And as Christmas approached in 1984, she had plenty to be excited about. She was 12 years old, Christmas was only a few days away, and she had been chosen to perform in her school's annual holiday choir concert. There was just one problem. Jonelle had a cold. Now, it wasn't serious, but it was enough that her parents weren't sure she should go to school. Jonelle disagreed. She really wanted to go. Unlike most kids who might see a cold as the perfect excuse to stay home, Jonelle was practically begging her parents to let her attend. She had Christmas gifts she wanted to give to her friends, she wanted to see them before winter break, and most importantly, she didn't want to miss a concert she'd been looking forward to for weeks. Eventually, Jim and Gloria agreed, but they gave her one condition. After the concert, she needs to come straight home and get some rest. Jonelle agreed, and on December 20th, 1984, she went to school. That decision would unfortunately be the last normal decision she ever made. On that evening, Jonelle's parents weren't going to be able to attend her performance, unfortunately. Her father, Jim, had promised to watch Jennifer, the other daughter, play basketball, and Gloria had learned that her own mother had become ill, so she needed to travel out of town. Jonelle didn't let that ruin the night, though. She was still thrilled to perform, and during the event, she met up with one of her friends, Deanna Ross. After the concert, Deanna's father, Russell, agreed to drive the girls home. The ride was completely ordinary. The two girls talked about the concert, talked about their day, they talked about Christmas. Nothing really seemed wrong. Eventually, Russell pulled his car up outside Matthew's home, and at this time, it was around 8:15 that evening. Jonelle said goodbye to Deanna. They wished each other a Merry Christmas. Then Jonelle stepped out of the car and walked towards the house. Russell and Deanna stayed in the vehicle for a moment, They watched her walk up to the driveway. They wanted to make sure she got inside safely. Jonelle reached the front door. She went inside, and then she turned on the foyer lights. It was a simple signal, a way of letting them know, I'm home. Russell and Deanna saw the lights. Satisfied that Jonelle was safely inside, they drove away. Neither of them knew they had just seen Jonelle alive, unfortunately, for the final time. Around 8:30 that night, the phone rang at the Matthews home. Jonelle answered. The caller was trying to reach her father, Jim, who was the principal of Platte Valley Elementary School. One of the teachers was calling to let him know that they unfortunately wouldn't be able to come to work the following morning. Jonelle took this message. It was an ordinary phone call, nothing out of the unusual, but it would become the last confirmed communication anyone had with her. Afterward, Jonelle apparently settled into the living room. She had her usual place on the couch. It was next to the family's Christmas tree near a space heater. With Christmas just a few days away, it's easy to imagine what that room must have looked like. A Christmas tree glowing in the corner, a 12-year-old girl curled up on the couch, her shawl around her shoulders, the heater running nearby. Everything quiet. Everything's normal. Except it wasn't. Because somewhere during that ordinary evening, someone entered Jonelle's life, and she never came back. Now, at around 9:30 p.m., Jim returned home. At first, nothing seemed unusual about the empty house. Jonelle was supposed to come straight home after the concert, but Jim initially assumed she had simply stayed out with her friends. Then he walked into the living room, and something immediately felt wrong. The space heater was still running, but Jonelle wasn't there. Her favorite shawl was lying across the couch, and her shoes were sitting in front of the spot where she normally sat. Everything looked as though Jonelle had been there for only a few moments earlier. But she was gone. Jim searched the house, nothing. He checked again, still nothing. Then the front door opened. Jim rushed downstairs. Jennifer had come home from her basketball game. It was around 10 p.m. at this point. Jim asked if she had seen Jonelle. Jennifer hadn't. She had no idea where her sister was. And that's when Jim knew something was seriously wrong. He called the police. Within about 15 minutes, officers arrived at the Matthews home on 43rd Avenue Court. They began searching the house and the surrounding property. And what they found, or rather what they didn't find, was very strange. There was virtually no evidence of a struggle. There was no obvious forced entry. Nothing immediately suggested that someone had broken into the house. So at first, investigators considered another possibility. Maybe Jonelle had left voluntarily. But there was a major problem with that theory. It was freezing outside, and Jonelle appeared to have left without taking a jacket or even a proper pair of shoes. Her father insisted that she wouldn't simply disappear like that, and if Jonelle had left on her own, Jim believed she couldn't have gone very far. Then investigators noticed something outside. Footprints. They were in the snow near the living room window, and they appeared to belong to someone much larger than Jonelle. The footprints suggested that someone may have been outside the home, watching. But despite the disturbing discovery, investigators continued considering the possibility that Jonelle had just run away. Police began looking through Jonelle's belongings. They checked her bedroom, they checked her school locker, they looked for anything that might suggest she had planned to leave. But they found nothing. And Jim continued insisting that his daughter had no reason to run away. She had friends, she had plans, she was supposed to have a friend stay over the following day even. She was going to participate in another Christmas presentation at church, and most importantly, Christmas was just a few days away. Jonelle was excited about her life. there was just simply no reason for her to disappear. As the days passed and Jonelle still didn't return, the runaway theory became harder and harder to believe. Investigators eventually shifted their attention toward the possibility that Jonelle had been kidnapped, and they began looking at people connected to her life. One person quickly came under suspicion, and that was surprisingly Jonelle's biological mother, Terry Vieira Martinez. Now, it wasn't unheard of for a biological parent to eventually try to reconnect with a child they had placed up for adoption, so investigators began to monitor Terry closely. For weeks, they watched her movements, hoping to find some connection to Jonelle's disappearance, but there was a major problem. Terry didn't know Jonelle was missing. In fact, she had been not even in contact with her ever. There was no evidence connecting her to the disappearance, and unfortunately, the lead went nowhere. So investigators went back to the drawing board. They interviewed friends, they interviewed more family members, neighbors, and even teachers, anyone who might have seen or heard something around the Matthews home that night. But every lead seemed to end in the same place. Nowhere. Story. A month after she vanished, a 24-hour prayer vigil was held at the church attended by the Matthews family. People gathered across Greeley to pray for Jonelle's safe return. Her family never refused to give up hope. They believed she could still be alive. They believed she could still come home. Then in March of 1985, President Ronald Reagan addressed the growing issue of missing children across the United States. During his speech, he specifically mentioned Jonelle Matthews by name. He talked about the enormous number of children reported missing and the heartbreak those disappearances caused to families. She would have recently celebrated her 13th birthday. Instead, she had disappeared just 5 days before Christmas. Even with the attention from the president and the media, the case remained unsolved. However, then another disturbing discovery was made. In May of 1985, a portion of a human scalp was found on a farmland in Weld County. For the Matthews family, this was the kind of phone call every parent would dread. Could it be Jonelle? Gloria had to face the possibility. The remains were examined, but thankfully, they weren't Jonelle's. The scalp belonged to someone else. Gloria later described the enormous relief she felt when she learned that it wasn't her daughter. But that relief came with another painful realization. Jonelle was still missing, and investigators still had no idea where she was. Years passed, then more years. The case grew cold. 10 years went by, and there was no answers. No sign of Jonelle, no indication that she was alive. Eventually, Jim and Gloria had to make a decision no parent should ever have to make. Nearly a decade after Jonelle disappeared, they had her legally declared deceased. But declaring Jonelle dead didn't give the family closure. It only confirmed the worst possibility they had spent years trying not to accept. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened to their daughter. They wanted to know where she had been all those years. Eventually, remaining in Greeley became too painful. Jim and Gloria retired to Costa Rica. Jennifer, the daughter, moved to Washington. The family tried to continue living their lives, but Jonelle was never forgotten. Then in July of 2019, almost 35 years after Jonelle disappeared, something happened that nobody had expected. The case finally moved. On July 23rd, 2019, construction workers were preparing land on the southeastern side of Greeley for an oil and gas pipeline project. Around 4:50 in the afternoon, roughly 15 miles southeast of Jonelle's former home, the workers uncovered something in the ground. Human remains. Investigators were immediately called, and eventually DNA testing confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to none other than Jonelle Matthews. After nearly 35 years, Jonelle had been found, and the discovery brought an unbearable truth with it. She hadn't disappeared, she had been dead the entire time. And investigators now had the opportunity to determine what had happened to her. The remains showed evidence of a gunshot wound to the skull. For the first time since 1984, investigators knew Jonelle hadn't simply just vanished. She had unfortunately been murdered. Her family finally had their daughter back, but they still didn't have the answer to the most important question of all. Who would do something like this? Moving forward with the investigation, on September 13th, 2019, investigators announced that they had identified a person of interest. His name was Steve Pankey, and his connection to the case was anything but ordinary. Pankey had once lived in Greeley. He had run for political office in Idaho, including campaigns for governor in 2014 and 2018, as well as lieutenant governor in 2010. But his connection to Jonelle went back much, much further. At the time Jonelle disappeared, Pankey and his then wife lived roughly 2 miles from the Matthews home. And Pankey had another connection. He had been a youth pastor at the same church the Matthews family attended. Yet, years later, Pankey claimed he had never known the Matthews family. He said that he didn't even know Jonelle existed until after her disappearance. That claim would become one of the most important contradictions surrounding him. Police searched his home in Twin Falls, Idaho. Pankey later complained that the investigators had taken numerous items but found nothing connecting him to Jonelle's murder. He even voluntarily provided a DNA sample, but investigators weren't interested in just where Pankey lived. They were interested in what he knew. According to investigators, Pankey had inserted himself into Jonelle Matthews' investigation over the following years. He reportedly approached authorities and claimed he had information that could potentially help solve the case, but strangely, he wanted immunity before he could provide that information. And there was another detail that caught investigators' attention. Years earlier, Pankey had apparently mentioned something about the footprints found outside the Matthews home. Specifically, he referenced the fact that the footprints had been covered up with a rake. That detail was very significant because it had not been made public at this point. So, how did Pankey know? At the time, investigators didn't have enough evidence to charge him, but the question remained. What exactly did Steve Pankey know about Jonelle Matthews? Pankey claimed that he had watched students walking home from Franklin Middle School, the same school Jonelle and her sisters attended. He also told investigators that he and his wife had been home the night Jonelle disappeared because they were preparing to leave town for a trip to Big Bear Lake in California. But when investigators spoke with Pankey's former wife, Angela Hicks, her account didn't completely match his. Angela said her trip had actually started on December 22nd, not the 21st. She also said the trip hadn't been planned in advance, it was unexpected. And when they returned to Greeley after Christmas, Angela noticed something strange. Steve suddenly seemed extremely interested in Jonelle's disappearance. According to Angela, he made her read newspaper articles about the case. Then he began digging around the yard of their home. She didn't know why. And later that week, a vehicle stored on her property mysteriously caught fire. There was another disturbing statement Angela remembered. In 2008, the couple's son had been murdered. At the funeral home, Angela recalled Steve saying that he hoped God hadn't allowed it to happen because of what had happened to Jonelle Matthews. Pankey later denied even making that statement. He said the thought had never crossed his mind. As investigators continued looking at Pankey, he became increasingly vocal with media. Rather than staying quiet, he gave interviews, and a lot of them. One of the most notable was a lengthy interview with KTVB. During the interview, Pankey spoke about his history with law enforcement and attempted to explain why police might have considered him a prime suspect. He also repeatedly discussed his sexual orientation and past experiences with law enforcement. He described police activity near his home on the night Jonelle disappeared and said he assumed officers were only there because of his previous problems with local authorities. According to Pankey, police eventually left and him and his wife went to bed. But there was one moment in the interview that drew particular attention. While discussing Jonelle's disappearance, Pankey referred to it as a murder. Now, that was very strange because at that point, Jonelle had been missing for 35 years. Her remains had not been found yet. The public did not know that she'd been murdered, and investigators had not publicly established that she'd been killed. So viewers immediately noticed the slip. Some interpreted it as a possible indication that Pankey knew more than he should have, but it's important to distinguish suspicion from proof. The statement alone did not establish that Pankey was responsible for Jonelle's death. However, it was simply another unsettling detail in an already complicated investigation. Pankey also told a story about information he had supposedly received from his father-in-law. According to Pankey, his father-in-law had worked as a groundskeeper at a cemetery. At some point, he allegedly heard from a police officer that there was a body that needed to be buried in a casket, and that the situation could somehow look bad for Steve. Pankey said he didn't know whether the information had anything to do with Jonelle, so according to his account, he contacted his attorney. His attorney warned him about the possibility of obstruction of justice. Pankey then contacted the FBI in Fort Collins. Eventually, he met with an FBI agent and went to the Greeley Police Department. Pankey insisted that whoever had told him about the body had never actually mentioned Joelle's name. He said he simply thought the conversation was strange, but investigators had already been watching his behavior for years, and his explanation continued to raise questions. Pankey also developed a theory that someone within law enforcement was responsible for Jonelle's disappearance. He repeatedly brought up this idea. He also took to social media to accuse the Greeley Police Department for trying to frame him. From Pankey's perspective, he claimed that he was the victim of an investigation that had gone too far. When asked why he wanted Jonelle's case solved, his response was essentially that he wanted everything to be over. He said he wanted Jonelle's family to have the same closure he had. And when asked whether he wanted the case solved so that his own name could be cleared, he agreed. Absolutely. Without a doubt. Pankey later sent a lengthy statement to KTVB attempting to clarify his position. In it, he named several people he believed investigators should consider. He mentioned Russ Ross, the father of Jonelle's friend who had driven her home. He mentioned Greeley's mayor. He mentioned the police chief. And strangely enough, he even included himself among the possible suspects. Pankey continued insisting the police were manipulating evidence to make him look guilty. But then came the biggest development yet. On October 13, 2020, Steve Pankey was indicted on charges connected to Jonelle Matthews' disappearance and death. The charges included first-degree murder and kidnapping. For the first time in more than 3 decades, the case had a defendant. The man who had lived only miles from Jonelle, the former youth pastor, the man who claimed he barely knew the family, the man who had inserted himself into the investigation from the very beginning, even the man who somehow knew about the details that had not been yet publicly released. Now, he was facing the possibility of being held responsible for what happened to Jonelle all those years. There was one more strange detail. After Pankey's connection to the case became public, investigators in true crime communities discovered that he had supported several true crime podcasts through Patreon. One of them was particularly significant. The podcast The Trail Went Cold had covered Jonelle Matthews' disappearance, and Pankey had reportedly been a Patreon of the show. The discovery only added another layer to an already bizarre case. Was he simply someone with an interest in true crime? Or was there something more behind his interest in Jonelle's story? That's a question that only the evidence can answer. And ultimately, that's what makes this case so unsettling. For 35 years, Jonelle's family lived without knowing what happened to their daughter. They didn't know where she was. They didn't know if she was alive. They didn't know who had taken her. They didn't know why. Then after decades of waiting, her remains were finally discovered, and suddenly a case that had been frozen in 1984 came roaring back to life. Jonelle wasn't a runaway. She hadn't simply disappeared. She had been taken from her home, killed, and buried. And someone knew exactly where she was. For years, that person had managed to remain free. But when Jonelle's remains were finally found in 2019, the past came crashing back into the present. Her family had the opportunity to bring her home, and investigators finally had the opportunity to ask the question they'd been asking since the cold December night. Who took Jonelle? Why? And why did it take nearly 35 years to find her? For the Matthews family, there could never be a way to undo what happened. But after decades of uncertainty, they finally had something they had been denied for most of their lives. The truth was no longer buried. Jonelle had finally been found. And now, after all those years, the search for justice could finally begin. Now, everyone, if you enjoyed this case, I know it's not something that is particularly unique and new. I know it has been told quite a few times on YouTube, but I want to make this channel specifically for continuing to shed light on cases that have happened years ago. We don't want to forget about what happened. We want to continue to remember. I want to try to do something a little bit more unique next time. I'm just trying to get my feet wet with these videos. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. It gives me the motivation to continue making more of these videos for you guys. I hope you guys have an amazing weekend, and I'll see you on the next one.